Hello, today is July the 12th, 2005. We're talking today with Edwin B. Preston, who was born September the 22nd, 1920, and resides at 16360 Red Oak Road, Tyler, Texas, 75707. Also in this interview is myself, Linda Cross, and Dick Steele, the videographer. Okay. Mr. Preston, what branch of service were you in?
I was in the Army Air Corps.
Okay, and what was your highest rank?
Finally, I got to be a corporal after I got out and come back home.
Okay.
I stayed a private all the way through the war.
Well, that's going to be a good story, I can tell you. Okay, how did you get into this?
I enlisted. This following monologue is about my experience as a prisoner of war, the Japanese during World War II. I'm 84 years old, native of Tyler. I attended Tyler High School, and later after the war I went to Tyler Junior College. I entered the labor market in 1939 as a laborer for the Cotton Belt Railroad. This activity was very disinteresting and had no promise for me, so a friend of mine, Talmadge Murray, who was graduated my high school class, decided we would enlist in the armed services. So we, on May the 15th, we enlisted in the Army Air Corps, which later became the United States Air Force, and World War II started. We were shipped to Marshfield in California, where we did our basic training, and we were assigned to the 4th Material Squadron.
And what year was this that you signed up?
1941. We drilled for 3 weeks in the civilian clothes because the Army did not have any clothes to issue us. I wore out a brand new pair of shoes during that time. After graduating from boot camp, I was assigned to the 4th Material Squadron, the 7th Material Squadron, the 4th Air Base, the 19th Bomb Group. While stationed at Marshfield, I did guard duty on the XB-19 experimental bomber, which was the forerunner of the B-29 bomber and other super aircraft. After I graduated from boot camp, I thought I was going to get to go to trade school and learn a trade, but I was informed that the Army had stopped sending trainees to school because they'd run out of funds. On October the 1st, 41, we were issued sealed orders and confined to our barracks, and shortly thereafter we were issued cold weather gear, coats, underwear, the whole bit. And that was payday also, and I received $30, which was my pay at that time. And with nowhere to spend it or go, I got into a crap game and I won $40. Well, the next day, we were shipped out to San Francisco. This was October the 4th, and we boarded an ocean liner named Preston, which was later changed to the Willow Holbrook. A sister troop ship named Preston Cleveland was changed to Tasca Bliss. There were 3 light cruisers and 2 submarines that accompanied us when we departed San Francisco. Just outside the Golden Gate Bridge, we ran into an area known as a cabbage patch, which was a rough stretch of water. After eating supper, I went down to brush my teeth, and to my surprise, about 3/4 of the 2,000 men on board ship were down in there seasick and were vomiting all over the place. All the toilets and all the sinks, even the showers, were stopped up. And that gastronomical fluid was sloshing back and forth as the ship progressed. I was very lucky though. I only got seasick one day, and after that I was okay. I was assigned to as a messenger for the officers, and that helped me pass my time while on board ship. It was awfully hot on the ship. There was such a hurry to get it going, get it on its way, that the engineers had not completed installing all the air conditioning. So we were very uncomfortable, and most of the soldiers slept on deck. I was quartered 3 decks below the top side, and of course it was very hot and crowded, no circulation. The bunks were 6 high, and they were so close together that when you got into them, your knees touched the one above you. And I had the bottom bunk, and I was scared to death. The guy on the top was going to hurt, and was going to splatter on the deck and get on me. But luckily that didn't happen.
Did you get claustrophobic?
No, I didn't get claustrophobic. I don't have any problem with that. After we got out some ways on the ocean, we were told that we were going to Philippine Islands. So all this gear that we had for the cold weather was for nothing. We were about 20 days en route and traveled about 7,000 miles via Hawaii and Guam. And we stopped at Hawaii about 4 hours. And only the officers and nurses were permitted to go ashore. And of course that made the soldiers very unhappy. We arrived in Manila in the Philippines on November the 41st, 1941. And when I went ashore, I could hardly walk because my legs had become accustomed to the rocking of the ship. And when I tried to walk on the ground wouldn't move. We were transported by truck to Clark Air Base, which was our headquarters. As a maintenance squadron, our job was to repair and service and paint the B-17 bombers that were stationed at Clark. On the morning of December the 8th, which was December the 7th, States time, our fighters received a scramble and were dispatched immediately. Still, this didn't cause anything but a business as usual atmosphere. It was during the lunch hour that we received news of the attack of Pearl Harbor. We heard this over the radio. Well, we went back to work that afternoon, and I was up on the wing of a B-17 bomber, camouflaging, when I heard somebody yell, "Hey, look at the Navy's coming in." Well, our fighters had just returned, and the last plane had landed. And when that happened, then the Japanese bombers began to come over. So we ran out to see what was happening, and somebody said, "Navy hail," says, "those are Jap bombers." Well, there were about 80 bombers in the perfect V formation at 3 different altitudes, and they began dropping their bombs on our field. And they started across. The first bombs hit the officers' quarters and it killed all of our officers. Then they got the hangars and the machine shops. And following the bombers came the fighters, and they started strafing everything that the bombers had missed. Well, when the first bomb hit, I ran and got into a trench. And just as I got into it, a bomb hit the other end of it and killed 3 of my friends. Well, I got out of that and ran to another area, which was in front of a B-17 that had not been destroyed. Well, Zero come in after that ship, and he started firing, and the bullets were whizzing all around my head, and it scared me to death. After that was over with, I was in a state of shell shock, and I had the dry heaves for 5 days, and I couldn't eat a thing. Since it had destroyed, they destroyed all of our equipment, all of our machine shops and our fighters, and they got 21 of the 36 B-17 bombers that we had lined up on the flight line. And that disturbed me before this happened, because we made no attempt to disperse the planes after we heard about the destruction of Pearl Harbor. Since all of our aircraft was destroyed and we had nothing to maintain, they made foot soldiers out of us. And they handed us old World War I Enfield rifles and VAR rifles and pistols, and put us on guard duty. Many of the soldiers, airmen, didn't know anything about rifles. They were all technicians. But I was lucky, and when I was going through boot camp, we had a tough old Army sergeant who hated our guts because we were Air Force, and he taught us how to use a rifle and a bayonet and to fight like an infantryman. And that training was put to good use for me later on. MacArthur's forces consisted of 11,796 Americans, 20,000 Filipino troops, and 100,000 Filipino reservists. But the real fighting force in the Philippines was 31st Infantry and the Filipino Scouts. The Japanese invaded Luzon December the 10th of 41 with approximately 200,000 troops supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Our forces were no match for the Japanese onslaught, but we held them at bay from December until April of 42. On Christmas Eve, December the 24th, we were ordered to bury all of our foot lockers with our cold weather gear in it. I was assigned to do guard duty over these boxes during the night. I felt very lonely at this point in time. I was an only child. I was 21 years old. I'd never been away from home, and now I was 7,000 miles on the other side of the earth. It was the loneliest night yet, but the stars were so bright and so close that it seemed as though you could reach out and touch them. Looking up in the heavens, I began to feel the awesome wonder of Christ's birth, and I prayed very hard for my parents. I prayed for courage, for strength, and for protection what lay ahead. On Christmas Day, our troops were ordered to retreat to Bataan. And for some unknown reason, our forces, in their haste to retreat, left all of our food, or most of our food, and our medicine and supplies in the warehouses for the Japanese to capture. On arriving Bataan, we were stationed on the Orion Line, which was the secondary line of defense. We didn't see much frontline combat. We were primarily doing scouting in no man's land day and night. We had to sleep on the ground with only a blanket to cover us, and I would cover up to my nose to keep the mosquitoes off of me. We were shelled and bombed every day for about 4 months. We suffered quite a few casualties. Our primary refuge was individual foxholes. I remember a time when a pair of shells came in and hit the very rim of my foxhole and the soldier next to me. And neither one of us could hear anything for over a week.
How big was your foxhole?
Just big enough to get in.
Just big enough for you?
That's it. You had to hunker down.
And that was enough protection?
And that was it. And the ground was very hard, very difficult to dig because it was a dry season. And this was in a rice paddock, which the dirt turned to just like cast iron almost.
And your buddies, were they next to you? Were they in line? Were they just scattered?
We were in a line. We had a firing line, and so in case we had to shoot.
Did you have anything banked up around you like?
No, it was just flat ground. When you just stuck your head up, you were very vulnerable. Very vulnerable. Our real enemy was not the Japs so much. It was the lack of food and medicine. By March of 42, our rations were cut to less than 1,000 calories a day. In desperation, we butchered a pony that was trapped out between our barbed wire defenses. And I was really looking forward to a steak and rice, but that didn't happen because before the cook could serve it, we received orders to move out, and our kitchen never did catch up with us. About the 1st of April of 42, the Japs brought in over 200,000 battle-hardened troops, and they began a final push. Homer was really upset with his troops because they had been held at bay by our forces. I was shipped up to a new front line of defense, and after a big firefight and some very heavy bombing, our forces were soon overwhelmed. We were ordered to retreat again. Well, the Filipino reservists panicked when the dive bombers began to attack us. Chaos reigned. Several of my fellow soldiers next to me were killed by shrapnel that fell around us. My GI medical kit was cut off on my backside by shrapnel. During the retreat, I became separated from our unit. There was no communication anywhere. We were just mayhem.
When you retreat, then you just kind of went barely away from the firing, or, retreat.
We everybody just started backing off and going back into the jungle, just scattered. It was, we left the wounded, left the dead, or whatever. There was no organization whatsoever. I became separated from my outfit, and I still hadn't eaten for 3 days. And I joined up with a small group of the 31st Infantrymen, and we began a forced march through the mountains for 2 days and nights without any food and very little water. And finally we caught up with our main forces, only to be told that General King was going to surrender us to the Japanese. We were advised to disable our weapons and wait for further orders. We were sitting on this mountain trail waiting. And at this point in time, I still had not eaten anything, and my water was gone. We sat there for about an hour until the Jap patrol began to come by. We stood at attention with our hands over our heads. As the soldiers passed us, they took rings, watches, whatever they wanted. They just were plundering us. And not a soldier touched me until the very last one in the column. And he stopped and he looked me up and down. He reached out and took my pocketbook out of my jumpsuit with my $40 in it. I had intended to send that money home to my parents, but of course there was no mail service then, and I never did get a chance to do that. That night, the Japs set up about 500 of us on a little hillside, and they set up a very heavy caliber machine gun in front of us. And we thought, well, this is it. They're going to execute us. And we could hear people screaming, and we could hear the Japanese hollering and yelling, and assumed that they were using the Filipinos for bayonet practice. We didn't know. We saw a lot of them dead after we marched out. But many of the soldiers became sick, and they were vomiting, and they were moaning, and crying, and praying, and so forth. And on account, they weren't sure what was going to happen to us. But as it turned out, the Japanese guards were just setting up the machine gun to guard us until daybreak. Well, the next morning, the death march began. We were marched out in groups of 500 to 1,000 men. And being a combat soldier, the Japanese had stripped me of everything except the clothes on my back. I had no helmet, no canteen, and no mess kit. And between the hot sun and my thirst, I thought I was going to die. The Japs delighted in giving us what they call the sun treatment by making us stand at attention in the hot sun for several hours at a time. And of course, I had no covering over my head, and the sun was really terrific. My thirst was so great that I risked getting shot or bayoneted when we came upon bar ditches that had a little water in them. This was rice country, and there was little streams along the side of the road. The water in them, of course, was polluted, but when I got a chance, I would run over and scoop up what water I could in my hand. We passed several wells along the way, and the fresh water was flowing out of them, but the Japs wouldn't let you drink. The Filipinos were just crazy. They were trying their best to get water, and the Japanese were bayoneting them and shooting them. So I didn't try to get water there. As it turned out, the bar ditches where I drank the water from were polluted by dead animals and humans, and I contracted dysentery, which has lasted me for the duration of my imprisonment and has continued throughout my life since that day. Many books have been written about that host of atrocities that committed by the Japanese during and after the march. And I don't believe the devil himself could have thought of some of the cruelties that the Japs used against the American prisoners or the Philippine prisoners. During the march, they were shooting and bayoneting and beating, clubbing, and beheading of the American and Filipinos. The trucks with the soldiers would come by us, and they would reach out over the side of the truck with their rifles and try to hit us in the heads. And so it was always smart to try to stay away from the trucks when they started coming by.
Do you think the Japanese were more brutal to the Filipinos than to y'all?
They were very much more brutal to the Filipinos. The Filipinos suffered hard, but they were brutal to the Americans too, but it seemed like they really took it out on the Filipinos. There was things they did to them that just you wouldn't believe. The general brutality of the Japs was unbelievable. Some disabled prisoners were buried alive. I was very lucky to escape that kind of treatment while on the march. If fellow prisoner couldn't keep going, you could not help him along. The Japanese wouldn't permit it. And if he fell down, then he was either bayoneted or you were shot.
Was this innate in you, or was it training that you had to go on, or was it the reality that they were going to shoot you if you helped someone? What caused you to go on?
You wanted to survive.
It was a
survival instinct, and kind of every man for himself, so to speak.
Well, do you think that it took a certain kind of smartness to know that, and some didn't really realize that?
I think so. Of course, there were a lot of guys who just had their spirits were broken, and they said couldn't go. They said can't keep going, can't go no more, and they just fall to the wayside. There was a lot of emotion involved. The Japs made us march day and night, and the only time we stopped was when they would change the guards. We'd go to sleep standing up, but we had to continue on. And I guess in all, I marched about 90 miles, if I count the mileage that I marched through the mountains with this 31st Infantry here. Usually, most stories say that the march is about 80 miles or 70 miles. It all depends on where you went into the march, into the line, as to how far you marched. The dysentery that I had contracted was very disabling. The Japanese wouldn't let you stop to relieve yourself, and as a consequence, my clothes and my body become a real mess. And there were some officers in our group who were trying to carry out everything they had, clothes and all. And of course, as they progressed along, it got heavy, and they started discarding their packets, their clothes. And I was lucky to find a set of khakis in which I picked up and I put on, and I wore them until they fell off of me. When we reached San Fernando, we were loaded into 1918 boxcars, which were 40 by 8 foot. These rail cars were used by France during World War I. There were over 100 men who were put in each car, and the Japs closed the door. There was no room to sit down or fall down, and the heat was unbearable. Body waste and stench were suffocating. Some of the men died standing up. The heat was so bad. After about a 4-hour trip, we arrived at Cape Tarlac and were detrained for Camp O'Donnell, which was another 10-kilometer walk. Prior to the 10K march, we were given a 3-hour sun treatment, and made to stand in the sun until the Japs were ready to move on. Official records indicate that 9,300 Americans reached O'Donnell. After completing the death march, approximately 6,750 of them died. Between 44,000 and 50,000 Filipinos arrived at O'Donnell and after the march, and approximately 12,000 to 18,000 of them are unaccounted for. And it's estimated between 5,000 and 10,000 died on the march. The first 40 days at O'Donnell, it was estimated 2,200 Americans died and 25,000 Filipinos died. There were not enough able-bodied men available to bury the dead. They were dying so fast. When we stopped at Tarlac, the Filipinos tried to give us food and water, but the Japanese forbid it. And I was managed to catch a small sugar cake that was thrown by a little Filipino girl. And this was the first food I'd had in over 12 days. On arrival at Camp O'Donnell, we were treated to a speech by the camp commander who informed us that we were without any rights or privileges. We weren't even considered prisoners of war. We were captives. O'Donnell was a partially completed military base intended for the training of the Philippine Army. The construction was stopped when the war broke out, and conditions at O'Donnell were beyond description. 90% of the buildings were nothing more than walls and a thatched roof. It had no floors, no doors, no windows. There were no sanitary facilities, there was no kitchen. There was one water faucet, which was about a half to 3/4 of a mile at the main gate from the barracks. And there was one building set aside for a hospital. And hundreds of men lay naked on the ground around it without any kind of cover. And what doctors they were, trying to help the patient, but they had no water to help them with or to wash them. Some of the men who had dysentery would go out and lay down by the open latrine until they died. We who could still walk would collect canteens and go for water at the main gate. This activity consumed about a half a day, there and back. And when the water bearers would return, there was always be canteens unclaimed due to the fact that the owner had died while the detail was out. I acquired a canteen and a mess kit that way. Up to that time, I ate off of a wooden shingle and a begged drink of water from the kitchen. Our food was a mush consisting of rice and sweet potatoes. Prior to my acquiring a mess kit, I had no dishwashing problems. All I had to do was go to the wood pile and get a nice wide shingle. The death toll at O'Donnell in April and May of '42 was about 50 a day for Americans and about 500 a day for the Philippines. I went over 2 months without washing or bathing. The first part of June '42 it was my good fortune to be assigned to a bridge detail that left O'Donnell. And we went out to a little place called Digupon, repairing a bridge that we had blown in our retreat. We were stationed in a schoolhouse. We had no covering, or blankets or anything. We slept on a hardwood floor, and I used books from the school library for pillows. The food wasn't any better. In fact, it was worse. But we could forage, and the Filipinos would slip and smuggle food to us occasionally when the Japs weren't looking. The death rate was still high. And later we were sent to another detail, which was at Clark Air Base. And it was like coming home. We were housed in almost the same barracks that we had in peacetime. The Japs had not bombed the barracks when they first hit Clark. All they were interested in was the hangars and the aircraft, so some of the barracks were still intact. Sanitation conditions were almost like stateside. We had flush toilets, we showers and all the water we could drink. The food was not improved. Food was shipped up from Manila by truck, and sometimes there were long delays. I know that at one time we ate sweet potatoes 3 times a day for almost a month. We cooked those potatoes any way you could think of. Fried, boiled, mashed, baked, or raw. And believe it or not, I still like sweet potatoes if they're candied. Most of the time we were so desperate, we would eat anything we could catch or steal. We catch dogs, we catch cats, wild chickens, even rotten fish from the Japs' garbage. And there was a weed that grew like grass called talila. It wasn't bad. It had a texture and a taste a little like spinach, but there wasn't much food value. It just helped to fill our bellies. There was an area in the camp where we could cook outside of the kitchen, and everyone, or most everyone, had a can or a small bucket, which was called a quan bucket. And anything you cooked in your bucket was called quan. The quan buckets were acquired for prisoners over time from the Navy tinsmith who made them from scrap tin and traded them for cigarettes and other items. And sometimes a prisoner would have some food with no quan bucket, and a person with a quan bucket, they would share and cook it together. We would steal fuel oil from the earth-moving equipment that was left by the Americans and use it for cooking oil. Due to the fuel shortage, the Japanese were mixing half coconut oil and half diesel oil to run the machines. And believe it or not, cooking oil was pretty good.
You mean the oil that you cooked in?
Yes, we used it.
Like to fry? Or,
Yeah.
Oh.
A little strong, but it was.
On weak stomachs at that, too. Oh.
While at Clark, we were used to repair the airfield and dig revetments for the Jap airplanes. To prevent our escaping, the Japs had divided us, all the prisoners, in 10-man escape squads. Each was accounted to the other 9. If a man escaped, the other 9 were to be punished by death. One time we had a prisoner go off from a work detail, and for some unknown reason, the Japanese did not punish the other 9 of us. But they did hold the barracks captain responsible, and they sentenced him to 30 days in solitary confinement on 1 meal a day. Well, they didn't have the facilities to carry out this sentence, so they built a small tin shed out in front of the barracks with no doors or windows, and the prisoner was fed through a slot in the side. And I believe this was the best fed prisoner in the camp, because when he was finally released, he had gained weight and he had quit smoking. We worked around many types of aircraft at Clark and saw numerous crashes that were due to poor training, drunkenness, and carelessness. I believe the Japs destroyed more of their own airplanes than we did. The Japs always had a happy hour bar along the side of the flight line for their pilots, and they would sit out there and drink until they were called to go out on a mission. Some of them would get so drunk that they couldn't even get into their airplanes. One day, we saw one go out of control due to the conditions of the high runway. The pilot veered into a line of fighters and bombers along the side of the field, and he destroyed 15 aircraft. The Japs didn't try to repair the aircraft, they just had a big scrap pile. One day while we were out on the work detail, one of the prisoners asked the guard, whom we called the lizard, and he looked like a lizard, permission to take a small piece of tarp back to camp, and he said it was okay. But the camp guards wouldn't let him take it in to the compound. They accused him of stealing. So they made him stand at attention in front of the guardhouse, and they took turns in beating him on the backside with the pick handles and the rifle butts. The whole camp was made to stand at attention and watch this happen. The soldier was a Marine, and he never fell down. And I don't remember whether he survived or not. After about 9 months at Clark Airfield, we were transferred back to Cabana Tawan, which was the main prison camp. And this was during the rainy season, and the condition at the camp was at its worst. Sanitation was horrible. The latrines were open pits and slit trenches, and they had no cover. Flies were so bad, so plentiful that you had to brush them off with one hand while you ate your food with the other. Some of the prisoners were so weak that when they went out to the latrine, they would slip and fall into the pits. Later conditions improved. They had covers were built over the trenches, which resembled the old outhouse that we used to have on our farms. Breakfast was always a cup of lugao, which was rice cooked down to the consistency of wallpaper paste. And it was served with no sugar or salt. There were two things that we missed the most, sugar and salt. Food was sometimes a little improved, especially when we got a little meat from water buffalo that the Japs took from the Filipinos. The Japs tried to make the camp self-sufficient by farming. The prisoners did as much sabotage as they could. When we were planting sweet potato slips, we would put them in upside down and bury them deep. Due to the poor harvest and weather conditions, Japs soon gave up the farming project. Occasionally, we would have gravy from the flour that had been left by our departing forces. And this flour was several years old and consisted mostly of weevils. When cooked, the dead insects would float to the top of the gravy and make a thick crust. Well, this was protein, but the taste was so bad that I could not eat gravy for over 40 years after I came home, and I'm still not very fond of flour gravy. At this point in time, my parents had not heard or received any information about me for over 2.5 years. And after I got home, I found out that they had tried every way in the world to find out something about me, but they had no luck whatsoever. Pressure from the International Red Cross persuaded the Japs to allow prisoners to send a pre-printed card home. The only message that we could send home was that we were okay and were doing well. Shortly thereafter, we began to receive Red Cross packages from South Africa. The packages came in just the nick of time because the physical condition of the prisoners was at its worst. Disease was rampant with malnutrition. There was malaria, cerebral malaria, scurvy, dysentery, tropical ulcers, plague, fungus, jaundice, wet berry, dry berry variant. Many men were losing their eyesight due to malnutrition, dengue fever, and pneumonia. And I had my share of these diseases. I had the dysentery, I had the scurvy and the phlegma, the wet berry, jaundice, tropical ulcers. I had dengue fever and was losing my eyesight. And my weight was down to about 95 pounds. All through my imprisonment, I did not contact malaria until I returned home to the States. And that happened one time when I was out at the swimming pool, and I had borrowed my dad's car, and it was one little old Ford you had to crank. And I cranked, and it backfired, and the crank hit me in the side of my nose, and cut my nose real bad. And I went to the doctor, and he sewed it up. And after that, I began to run temperature. And every afternoon, my temperature would come up. Well, I should have recognized the symptoms of being malaria, because that's when malaria worked. Went to the doctor. He kept fooling with me. He didn't really know. And finally, he decided, well, maybe you've got malaria. Let's take a blood test and see. And sure enough, I had malaria.
Well, all this time, were you at Cabana Tawan still? Did you finish out at Cabana Tawan?
No, I'll tell you later. I went to Japan later. But all through my imprisonment, a friend of mine, Edwin, I thought one time I was going to die from dysentery. I was just so bad, so down. And a friend of mine, Dorman Ivy, had 2 or 3 sulfur pills that he gave to me that saved my life. Sulfur pills back then had a very high trade value. You could trade them and get most anything you wanted for them. And that was a great sacrifice for him. And his act of kindness saved my life. And I never had the opportunity to repay or to ask or to thank him for the gift of life that he gave me. Life at Cabana One was very tedious. We continued to struggle to survive. As I said, starvation was rampant. And for several months, rumors kept our spirits up and morale up. But as time passed, prisoners began to give up. And many men died from broken spirits and a sense of hopelessness. And the death rate was about 20 to 30 a day. And the burial detail would take them out and put them in an open pit. And this was during the rainy season. And when they dumped the corpse in the hole, they would float. And they would have to hold them down with a shovel while they put dirt on them. And I was on this detail several times, and it was not a very pleasant experience. We had nicknames for all of our outstanding Japanese personalities, whether they were kind or bad. We had some we called Porky, Piggy, Lizard, Big Speedo, Little Speedo, Tojo, and then one personality we called Donald Duck for obvious reasons. Donald Duck eventually learned his nickname, and he began to ask the prisoners who Donald Duck was. Well, some smart prisoner told him he was a famous movie star. Well, that pleased him to no end. The Japanese had great egos, and he'd go around strutting around, pointing to himself, "Me, #1 Donald Duck, movie star." Well, the Japanese made a movie of the bombing of Pearl Harbor for propaganda purposes, and it was very realistic. We had a movie night, and all the prisoners of war and off-duty Japs were privileged to see how good the Imperial Air Force was. Afterward, we were treated to a surprise. There was going to be a cartoon. I think you know where we're coming to up next. The lights flashed across the screen in bright Technicolor DD by Walt Disney. Well, the silence of that several thousand men was so loud you could hear mosquitoes sneeze at 20 paces. Then there was a low, moaning roll across the amphitheater like distant thunder. Well, Donald Duck was at the gate next day with his club. He was looking at each work detail for the smart guy who told him who Donald Duck was. And of course, the prisoner didn't go out on details for quite some time. I'm sure some were addicted to nicotine. I was. And if you've ever tried to quit, you know how strong the craving is. In my prison situation, in any prison situation, there are haves and there are haves not. And I was a have not. And my craving for nicotine was so strong that I would go around the camp picking up the cigarette butts of the haves. This was a common practice of many prisoners who had run out of tobacco. And my school friend Leo died because he could not and would not eat the rice, and he traded his food for cigarettes. When the American forces began to put pressure on the Japs down south, they began to ship all able-bodied men to Japan. And since I was able to walk without aid, that made me a candidate for Japan. About 1,100 of us were shipped to Manila and put in a hold of a supply ship at Noto Maru that had just unloaded a large contingent of horse-drawn artillery. One thing they forgot to do was to clean out the debris left by the horses. We were made to march into the hold and stand front to front, back to back, side to side, until the hold was filled to capacity. Then we were told to sit down, and each man only had enough room to sit, and that's all. A wooden bucket was placed in the center of the hold for a target. I think every man had the dysentery, and when an urge hit him, it was impossible to reach the tub in time when you could not move without stepping on someone. And this would invoke a fit of shouting and cursing. We were fed from a bucket lowered in the hole twice a day. And whether you got anything to eat depended on the skill of those who served the food. If they dipped out portion too large, there would be not enough for everyone. And there'd be no more until the next meal. Water was served the same way, but only once a day. and each prisoner would pass his canteen up to be filled, and sometimes the Japs wouldn't leave the bucket long enough that everyone could be served. I managed to survive by having a bottle of water and some coconut that I had smuggled in, and by nursing my supply, I had a little better time than some did. The heat was unbearable, and for several days we were in the tropical climate before reaching cooler climate in Japan. We were en route some 11 days, I think. I'm not quite sure because I lost track of time. In fact, after this experience, something happened to my emotional psyche, for I've never felt or acted the same since, and neither has any of the other prisoners who were on the ship. After the war, I heard many horrible experiences suffered by other prisoner ships, better known as hell ships. Some were bombed or torpedoed by friendly forces. The American forces were not aware of the cargo hidden in the holds of these target ships. The Japs were supposed to mark them, that they were carrying POWs, but they failed to do so. One famous hell ship was the Arasan Maru. On October 24, 1944, it was torpedoed by American submarines. There were 1,800 prisoners in the hold, and the Japs closed the hatches on them and abandoned the ship. Only 6 men survived and were rescued by Chinese fishermen. The men believed that they would survive so they could tell what happened to the other 1,794 men. After we entered the safe waters of Japan, we were permitted to go topside for a bath and medical attention. I, as well as many others, almost didn't make it up the ladder. My old legs just wouldn't cooperate after sitting for such a long time. Sometimes, something made me keep on trying, and I finally made it up the ladder to the top side. After rinsing off the salt water, I made for the dispensary that had been set up by some American doctors who were been on board and who had been quartered on the deck of the ship. Hoping to get something for my dysentery, I asked the doctor for some medicine, and to my surprise, I met a doctor from Tyler, Texas, Dr. Golden Turney. He has several brothers in Tyler who owned and operated furniture stores from the early 1900s. He was the youngest of the brothers, and before the war, he had practiced in California. After exchanging greetings with the doctor, we were returned to the hold. On arriving in Japan, the prisoners were divided into 100 units and sent to various parts of Japan for labor. I was assigned to a steel mill in the middle section of Honshu Island, near the China Sea. From the port of entry, we had to travel overland by train for about 8 hours, and I thought we were never going to get there. They were sending us to various industrial complexes, and I was assigned to a smelting mill. My job at the mill was a stoker on an open hearth electric furnace. I feel like I got that job because the Japanese had given us a little card asking us what we did in the United States, and I put on my card that I had stoked a furnace on a boiler on the railroad, and I believe that's why I got that job. I didn't have to go into the mines like a lot of them did.
You felt that maybe saved your life?
I think so. The food was much better, but the work was harder and longer hours. We worked 12 hours on and 12 hours off, 30 days a month. The blast from the furnace was so loud it has ruined my hearing. It was very cold, and the snow came early in September and stayed late in May. The snow sometimes was 4 to 6 foot deep, and we had to go up on the roof of the building and shovel it off to keep the buildings from falling in, collapsing. The barracks had no heating, and the only time we were warm was when we were on the furnaces. We had a little hibachi box in the barracks, and the guys would bring in anything they could find that would burn, and that was the only fire that we had. We had no other kind of heating in the building. And the building itself had a real heavy tile roof, and the walls were mud thatch. And I guess the reason they were built that way was because we were in a earthquake area, and we had several earthquakes while we were there, but it didn't do any damage to our building. I think we were eating a little better than the civilians who were working at the mill. They were furnished food rations, a food ration by the corporation that we all were working for. When they received their ration, there was very much complaining, especially when they saw how much food the young women would bring in from the farms with them. Our clothing was they had one lightweight cotton work suit, one padded dress suit, one old GI overcoat, and 3 cotton blankets. 2 prisoners would team up and we'd make a sleeping bag out of the 6 blankets. One would sleep during the day while the other one worked, and one depending on what shift you were working. Most of our shoes were worn out. When the men worked days, would exchange shoes with the guys working nights and vice versa. And pneumonia took its toll, and everyone who died was cremated, and their ashes were put in little small pine boxes and placed in a Shinto shrine. The plant was next to a railroad yard, marshalling yard. There were 100 carloads of food and raw materials ready for shipment. Some of the prisoners on the night shift found a carload of soybeans, and they helped themselves to a supply. They were able to do this because the civilian guards were very lax and didn't watch us very closely. When we were in the prison camp, we were under military guards, but when we were in the plant working, we were under civilians, and all they had was a little swagger stick. There was no concern for our escape because there wasn't anywhere for us to go. So the guarding was very lax. The guards spent most of their time in the little ready room, drinking sake and telling stories and talking about the war. And everyone could smell the beans roasting on the slabs that we poured from the furnace. And for some reason, the Japs never did catch on. People asked if we tried to sabotage. Well, we did. We tapped the furnace to drain the ore, liquid ore, out of it. And the plug we put in was made out of carbon and clay. And the Japs let the Americans do that for a while, and the American prisoners got on to putting too much carbon in the clay. When they packed it in the hole, it would just freeze, and you couldn't poke it out. So we would shut down a furnace that way for maybe 12, 24 hours, while the Japanese would take their arc guns and burn that core out of the bottom of the furnace.
Did they figure out what was?
They finally figured it out and started doing it themselves. They realized we were putting too much carbon in the clay. The Japs also had a food growing in every plot that was open, and they had a beautiful potato patch right next to the plant. It was a beautiful garden. Some of the prisoners found a pair of Japanese tennis shoes, which was equivalent to our tennis shoes. They had a split toe, only they had a split toe for the big toe and the other for the four-toe. So the prisoners would slip out at night in the patch, pull the potatoes out from under the plants, pack the dirt back so it looked like it hadn't been disturbed, and they'd have nice potatoes to eat. Well, the Japanese would go out to harvest their potatoes, and when they pull the plant up, there's no potatoes. Well, they got real excited about that. And they just knew that we were doing it, but they couldn't prove anything or say anything because the only tracks in the garden was the Japanese tennis shoes. The only beating I ever received was from a civilian guard. I had stolen some rock salt from a warehouse next to the mill, for we were all desperate for salt due to the excessive sweating on the furnace, while on the furnace. The Japanese only gave us a little teaspoonful of granulated salt once a week. Salt is a very scarce item in Japan. I had the salt in my canteen cup with the lid on it, and during my tour of the furnace, this civilian guard was snooping around in our mess gear in our break room. He found my cup of salt, and when I came down from the break, he confronted me with it, and I told him where I got it. Japs have a very serious attitude about lying. They beat you to death for lying than for any other act. He took off his Sam Brown belt that he was wearing across his chest, and he beat me in the face several times. He took my cup and he sent me back to work. Well, when I returned the next break, there my cup was with a lid on it. I opened it up and half of my salt was still in the cup. I suppose he took the other half for himself. Most Japanese foods, except for grains, were pickled in salt, and this included dried fish. That was the only way the Japanese got most of their salt, and they couldn't understand why we kept asking for salt. The Japanese gave us tobacco rations, and the tobacco looked like red monkey hair, but it didn't have much of a kick to it. And sometimes they would give us Chinese cigarettes, and they were very powerful. One drag, and you'd fall on your butt. One time the Japs had no tobacco to give us, and the prisoners were going berserk. I was so desperate, I even tried to smoke the bark off of the cedar post that held up our barrel. Wow, that was rough on my lungs. We had no communication with the outside world, and we could not really tell how the war was going. We overheard the civilians talking about the B-29 bombers, but that was about all there was that we understood. The American bombers began dropping firebombs on the industrial district next to us, and each night they would come up and drop firebombs, and they kept coming closer to us. And they were burning everything. Had the war gone on for 3 more days, I guess we would have been the next target. Our Jap officer in charge of our camp was a veteran of the Chinese War. He'd lost an arm in the service. He was an alcoholic, and when he was sober, he was a Japanese officer to the letter. But when he was drunk, he loved everybody, and he wanted to come to America when the war was over. We called him the one-armed bandit because he was constantly begging us for cigarettes. He told us the Americans had dropped a bomb by parachute and killed thousands of people, and peace was being discussed. We had no idea what he was talking about. Of course, we didn't know anything about an A-bomb. The largest bomb that we remembered was the 1,000-pound blockbuster. By mid-August of '45, the one-armed bandit told us that the war was over with, and Japan had surrendered. And strangely enough, there was not any real celebration or excitement among the prisoners. Our brains were drained of emotion. The Japanese asked us what we wanted, and our camp officer said he wanted a photographer to take a picture of all the POWs in the camp. And of course we asked for more food. I asked for a fishing rod, but they didn't have any bait, so I had to catch some bugs, and I went fishing in a canal that was just behind our camp. But I didn't have any luck. The Japs brought in truckloads of vegetables and a cow, and we really began to eat high on the hog. The American planes were coming over, and they were dropping cigarettes, candies, food rations, clothes, canned goods, everything. In the meantime, the Japanese opened up a warehouse that was in our compound that contained all kinds of new GI clothes. They didn't want to give us these things during the war because they were telling their people that they were winning the war, and they didn't want us to look so good in American clothes.
Was this when you were in this camp?
Excuse me?
Is that when you were in this camp?
Yes, that's the camp.
Okay. You want to describe the building that y'all were in right here? In that camp?
This is the heavy roof, the tile roof, and as you can see, the wall is just plaster. Let's see, where is yours truly here? Right there, there's yours truly.
Right here?
Yes.
Wow.
And if you look real close, you can see the Japanese officer in the middle here with our officers, and a few Japanese civilians that were in the camp too.
So this was everyone that was in that camp, that work camp?
Yes.
Okay.
There were 350 of us in the camp. They wanted us to look good, so they gave us all the clothes we wanted, and they wanted it to look like that we had been treated good, according to all
The rules, no. Prisoners of war rules.
prisoner of war. Yes, thank you. But of course that wasn't true. The clothes that we had were very inadequate. And a little later, a field officer showed up in a Jeep, and he advised us to stay put. He said we'd receive orders later. We were quite disappointed because we were expecting a large company of American soldiers coming to liberate us. And about 3 weeks later, we were marched down to the train station, and on the way down, we passed 4 or 5 other POW camps, and we had no idea there were any other prison camps in the area. We thought we were the only one. Upon arriving at the train, we were put aboard upon arriving at the train station, we were put aboard a transport back to Kobe. On the way, all we could see was the utter devastation that the American firebombs had destroyed miles and miles of industry up and down the valley. And upon arrival in Kobe, we were placed on a hospital ship for physical examination and then placed on a troop ship to Manila, where we were in quarantine camp for about 3 weeks. Finally, we were put on a troop ship for San Francisco. On the voyage home from the Philippines, it took us about 30 days. We arrived in the U.S. on October the 20th, 45. During that period of time, I gained over 60 pounds. The captain kept the galley open 12 hours a day so that the prisoners could eat all the time and any time they wanted to. While on board this ship, I was assigned to the laundry room, and I didn't do anything. I just sat and talked to the sailors. They wanted to know all about my POW days. And they asked me if there's anything I wanted. And I said, well, I'd like to have some ice cream. So they went and got me a bucket, one of the GI buckets of ice cream. And I sat there and I ate the whole thing. And they couldn't believe it. Of course, it wasn't real rich. Upon arrival in San Francisco, we were placed in Letter General Hospital for further examinations. Then we were put on a troop hospital train and shipped to Temple, Texas. We were kept there a few more weeks and were then given a 120-day pass home. For 4.5 years, my pay was $30 a month. After I got home, I was promoted to corporal, and I drew corporal's pay for 120 days. I was awarded the American Defense Ribbon with 1 Bronze Star, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Ribbon with 2 Bronze Stars, Philippine Defense Ribbon with 1 Bronze Star, Good Conduct Medal, Prisoner of War Medal, Distinguished Unit Badge with 2 oak leaf clusters, lapel button, Victory Ribbon, Corporal Stripes, 1 Service Bar, and 7 Overseas Bars. After I was discharged from the service in March of '46, I came back to Tyler and went back to work for the railroad. A short time later, I decided I wanted to go to college on the GI Bill. And while attending Tyler Junior College, I met my wife, Rachel, of 58 years plus, at a local skating rink. For me, it was love at first sight. After a week later, I saw her again uptown in Tyler on the square working in a hat shop. I went into the store and asked her for a date. We were married in 1947, and our first child, Marcus, was born while I was at Baylor University. Upon graduation from Baylor, I couldn't find a job because the country was in a very deep depression. So I returned to Tyler and resumed work for the railroad. There I stayed until I retired after 43 years of service. I don't think Rachel knew what she was getting to when she said yes, that she would marry me. No woman should have to put up with a man for 58 years plus with him who is eternally in bad health, moody, subject to periods of depression. Depression seems to be a characteristic of most ex-POWs, and Rachel had to put up with me for more than her share. I know she's the most wonderful woman in the world, and I'm grateful for her love and loyalty and support for these many years. And I thank God every day for sending her my way to take care of me. The question often asked of me is what kept me going, and how did I survive the ordeal of my POW experience? And my answer is that it was hope, prayer, and the grace of God that I survived. I have to submit that while I was praying constantly, there were times when I thought God didn't hear me. There were chaplains in the prison camp, and they tried to hold services, but when you're constantly starving and can't think of anything but food, you can't concentrate on spiritual things. I give the chaplains credit for trying, and I tried to go a time or two, but I simply couldn't concentrate. I was so hungry. When I returned home, I thought God might have a place for me due to my near-war experiences that I survived, but that didn't happen. Instead, I've been called to be a faithful husband and a loving father and a follower of Christ. And as a layman, I constantly try to witness and serve others in Jesus' name. In retrospect, I'd like to add a postscript to this monologue. One of the most persistent and lasting scars of my imprisonment by the Japs is the effect of a constant anxiety and dread that pervades my spirit and my mind. You never know if you're going to see the next day. The Japs were expert at keeping prisoners in a state of terror and apprehension. For instance, a constant standing for roll call was always apprehensive, for you never knew if someone had gone over the hill. After reading and hearing all the horror stories that many of my comrades suffered, I see my POW experience as relatively mild. I did not witness or experience many of the brutal acts committed by the Japs against the Americans. Whether this was luck, faith, or divine intervention, I don't know. This is the end of my monologue, and I hope I've not been too boring. And I thank you for listening to me. May God bless you.